Where are you reading from right now? Tell me in the comments, the town, the city, the country, and share one thing we could do to make these stories hit home for you. Praise, critique, weird suggestions, all of it matters. If you like what you read, hit follow, share with a friend, and drop a line below to keep the conversation going. The summer over, Sage Hollow had a slow, patient heat that made the hills shimmer and the air taste faintly of wild sage and dust. Jonah Mercer cut an impressive silhouette against it, tall, broad-shouldered, a man who belonged to open sky and long afternoons. Yet inside his lonely house, he felt small, as if the sun itself had forgotten to warm him. For a decade, Jonah had lived like a ghost in the bones of a house he once filled with laughter. He ate from cans, drank coffee that was more fuel than comfort, and spoke only when necessary. Folks learned to give him a wide berth. Children were hushed when he passed, and women crossed the street rather than exchange an awkward greeting. The note he had nailed, almost on a dare at first, to Harlan's General Post, had hung there 3 weeks before anyone answered. Cook wanted. Good pay, no trouble. Miriam Hale arrived in Sage Hollow the way a quiet storm arrives, unannounced but unmistakable. She stepped down from the stagecoach with a single battered carpet bag and a steady look in her green-gray eyes. She was 38, recently widowed, competent in the small, stubborn way of people who survive hard things. Her mourning was practical. A plain dress, hair pulled back, pockets patched and well used. It was grief that didn't scream. It just sat like an old scar beneath her collarbone. "Mr. Harlan?" she asked when she entered the store, and the proprietor blinked at her as if she'd announced she could wrangle lightning. "You sure you've the right notice, ma'am? That there's Jonah Mercer's place," he said, half warning, half curiosity. "He keeps to himself." Miriam's chin lifted. "I read the notice. Good pay, no trouble. I can do both." They rode out to the Mercer place in Harlan's battered wagon. The road unspooled past fenced pastures and lonely gullies. Miriam watched the land like someone reading a familiar map. Fences needing mending, a low gate that sagged, a garden that had surrendered to weeds so long ago, it felt more like a field of memory than a kitchen plot. The house came into view, a wide porch log structure with windows like sleepy eyes and a roof that had long ago given in to weather. The bones were honest and solid. It looked like the kind of place that would answer when someone called. Jonah appeared from the barn with a gait measured and slow, the sort of careful movement born of habit and a desire to conserve something no one else could see. He was 44, the top of his hair threaded with silver, beard unruly in a way that used to be considered dashing and now looked like neglect. His eyes, pale and liquid as a winter stream, assessed Miriam as if he were deciding whether she might be useful or dangerous. "You the cook?" he asked. His voice came from a place of gravel and cold river stones. "Miriam Hale," she said. "Yes, sir. I'm here to work." He stood for a long moment with the sun making little medals of the dust motes between them. Finally he nodded. "I pay $25 a month and give room and board. You take the room at the end of the hall. I'll take the one by the stairs. You start now if you want." Miriam's hands moved like someone who knows how to turn need into action. When the wagon lurched away and left her at the threshold, she shouldered her bag without looking back. The house greeted her with an odor of stale coffee and old wood. Dishes were stacked on the porch to dry. Laundry hung pale and crooked on a line. The kitchen was serviceable, but neglected. The pantry held more dust than preserves. It smelled like a place someone had given up on, and she liked it immediately. A home waiting for effort. Her first dinner was humble. Fried chicken with biscuits, gravy made from rue and patience, and a small apple cobbler, because there was always room for a little mercy. Jonah hovered near the doorway while she cooked, an immovable shape at the edge of her light. He did not come close enough to watch the stirring or the frying. He watched as men who had been wounded watch a sunrise, from a distance, as if proximity might shatter what remained of them. When she called him, he took his seat like a man relearning how to use a chair. The silence at the table was not rude so much as carved, deliberate, heavy, shaped by a decade of not needing anyone. Miriam ate slowly, tasting a new quiet that was almost comfortable. She watched Jonah study his plate like it was a map back to something he'd misplaced. On the third evening, as she cleared plates, Jonah's voice, dry and hesitant, broke the practiced silence. "It's been 10 years, he said. "No woman in the house for 10 years. Miriam's hand paused on the dish towel. 10 years. In her decade in the world, she had learned to meet confessions with the same steady temper she used for kitchen fires. "This job is to cook and keep the house," she said. "You don't have to be worried about anything else." He looked at her with something like shame and something like relief swirling together. "I know. I just wanted you to hear it out loud." He set down his cup with fingers pale and tight. The admission settled between them and changed the room's temperature. For the first time since he'd walked out of youth into a house full of ghosts, Jonah had said the name of his loneliness. Days slid into a rhythm. Miriam taught herself the exact way the stove burned and how Jonah liked his coffee, black, steady as a promise. He began to ask small questions about the food. "Do you use lard in the pie? Where did you learn to make biscuits so light?" Little queries that were not quite conversation, but were more than mere civility. She noticed him in the small ways that make a person reveal themselves. The deliberate gentleness he used with an injured calf, the hat peg faithfully occupied by an old leather hat, the way he hummed under his breath while fixing a broken fence post. She found herself storing those small things like treasure. 3 weeks after Miriam arrived, while dusting the parlor mantel, she found a photograph tucked awkwardly behind a brass candlestick, as if someone had tried to hide it from sunlight. The picture showed a younger Jonah with a woman whose smile was everything the photograph could have wanted to be. A little girl, hair like a halo in the old sun, sat on his shoulders, grinning at the world with the kind of trust that made Miriam's chest ache. Jonah's footsteps were a storm and a whisper all at once. "You shouldn't be looking at that," he said, voice flat. He took the photograph gently as if it might break like glass. He turned it face down on the mantel, and his hands began to shake. "My name was Lydia," he said after a long breath. "That's Evie." Miriam felt a fist at her ribs tighten. "What happened?" "Fever," Jonah said. "Winter of '84. I was in Denver for a week selling a load of cattle. Came home to graves in a silence that never left." He closed his eyes as if the scene had weight enough to press his eyelids down. His voice was small then, a thing that needed protecting. "Been blaming myself ever since. There are confessions that break a person, and there are confessions that stitch them." Jonah's was both. Miriam thought of her own losses, of Elias Hale, the man who had been her compass until he made choices that wrecked more than his own life, and how towns had a habit of making widows their scapegoats. She told Jonah how she'd lost that marriage, how debtors had forced her from the house they'd built together, how reputations are fragile things that, if you don't tend them, blow away in the wind. Their conversation was a kind of barter, pain exchanged not for pity, but for understanding. The more Jonah spoke, the more his walls showed hairline cracks. It was not an immediate thaw, but a slow one, a laugh that arrived like a late-season thaw, a question that poked beneath the surface. Miriam found herself anticipating those small sharings, the way someone starved for company counts the hours until a train arrives. Then the night of the storm came. A scouring rain and wind that made the house flex and whimper. Lightning drew white veins across the sky, and the world outside felt as if it might unburden itself entirely. Jonah walked into the parlor with 2 cups of coffee and set one down beside Miriam on the sofa. "These storms can get into a body," he said. "Figured company might help." They talked until the storm flattened their words. Talk moved from trivialities, books they liked, food they'd never learned to cook, to the abandoned maps of other lives, the aspirations they had left on the backs of receipts and on the floors of packing boxes. Conversation loosened something in Jonah, a small, dangerous thing called hope. So when Miriam dozed, it felt like a piece made of glass. She woke to a sound that had no place in the world, a wet, keening choking that came from somewhere between the house's ribs. Jonah's body was arched and suspended, his features gone white, and he hung above the sofa as if hoisted by invisible hands. Miriam's hands moved before her mind could catch up. She ran and grabbed at him, and her fingers met air where bone and flesh should have been. It was like trying to hold smoke. Panic and a protective instinct collided. Miriam struck out with the flat of her hand, a slap that landed on something that felt like both skin and freezer-thin glass. Jonah crashed back onto the sofa in a heap, wild and heaving, eyes rolling like a man waking from drowning. "You're here," she said, pushing toward him with words that were both command and prayer. "Come back. Jonah, Come back." When he defied the pull and returned to the room of the living, his hands trembled and his face was ashen with terror. "They call me," he whispered. "They call me, and it's warm and quiet there. I can't help it." "Who?" Miriam asked. "My wife, my little girl," he said. "Sometimes it's like being tugged by ropes. Other times it's like doors opening and I'm walking right through. I tried the doctor. Dr. Ames said it's grief, said it's nightmares, but it isn't a dream. Not this." His voice shook as if the concluding syllables might break something inside him permanently. The next days were cautious. Jonah refused to speak of the incident and then spoke of it in fractured pieces. Sometimes the choking came again. Worse, lingering, a coldness that settled under Miriam's skin. It was not enough to be explained away. It was something that moved at the edge where guilt and the unknown meet. Worse, a rumor can travel like a prairie fire in a town with a single main street. 3 days later, 3 riders thundered into the yard. One of them dismounted with a self-satisfied swagger that made Miriam's skin prickle. Silas Kendrick owned half the county and had ambitions on the other half. Men like him measure wealth, like men breathe air. It's a constant function of their being. Miriam watched from the kitchen window as Jonah met them. Silas's manner was greasy with the confidence of a man who knows everyone fears his ledger. He raised his voice. Jonah's jaw closed, and his hands dug into the arms of his chair for a moment. A small storm before a careful, cool reply. Miriam couldn't hear the words, but she saw the gestures that carried meaning. Silas's fingers pointed toward the house and then the sofa where Miriam had slept, his mouth moving like the hungry mouth of small-town gossip. They left with the same swagger, but not before Silas had made it clear he had knowledge of the sofa and the firelight. Rumor, once kindled, finds tinder in the most unlikely places. By the afternoon, tongues in Sage Hollow had begun a slow, insidious whisper. Jonah's reaction was practical and painful. He told Miriam to pack. "Leave," he said, voice flat. "I'll pay for your passage on the stage tomorrow. You don't need to get caught in what's coming." The choice lodged in Miriam's lungs like a stone. She had fled before, from shame, from men who demanded currency she could not give, and she understood Jonah's logic. Avoid the scandal, and the land would remain in his hands. But someone else's prudence felt like deserting a ship in a storm. "I'm not your scandal," she said quietly, folding a shirt. "Neither are you," he insisted. "Silas will use this to bully me out. He'll call it impropriety. He's got friends who sign papers in the town bank. This is for the ranch. If you leave, it dies down. You go, and I keep the land." She looked at him, really looked, and saw how the man who used to wake with the sun had been hollowed. "And what happens to you?" she asked. "You'd stay here, alone with those voices?" Jonah's face closed like a book. "It's better. People expect a man to be alone. They'll forgive him sooner." Miriam's decision did not feel noble. It felt like stubbornness wrapped in fury. She began to pack, not because she wanted to leave, but because leaving would be an admission that the town's whisper had power to decide 2 strangers' fates. Then the choking started again, muffled and weak at first, growing until the sound filled the rafters. She froze at the bedroom door when Jonah's sounds stopped altogether. The room was moonlit, and Jonah lay on the floor by his bed, his body strange and slack, his face the color of old paper. His throat bore red abrasions like the outline of invisible hands. Miriam's fingers turned white as she checked for breath. It was fast and shallow, but it was there, a small, stubborn drum. She sat on the floor beside him, breath shallow, and listened to the small, irregular drumbeat. All the decisions the 2 of them had made to protect themselves from the world felt thin and useless under the sudden clarity of someone who might die because he was carrying a weight no doctor could see. She stayed. She slept on the floor beside his bed, an arrangement that would earn them criticism if the town heard, but which felt like the only honest thing to do. Jonah woke at dawn bewildered and grateful, and small, in a way only 2 people who have been saved by hands can be. "It was your voice," he said, later when the sun had warmed the floorboards. "You kept talking. They were singing, and I almost went, thought about going with them." "You stayed," Miriam answered. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled. "Of course I stayed." They shared the small, cowardly truths that build a real intimacy. Jonah told Miriam of the other woman he'd had, while Lydia begged him not to leave. He told her the old, raw confession. I chose wrong. It landed between them and did not break them. You think they want me dead? He asked at one point, fingers fumbling with an old button. No, Miriam said. I think you've been living with a punishment you sublet to fate. Guilt isn't them. It's something you hold. They'd probably want you to quit carrying it. Her honesty was not a sermon. It was a hand offered. He took it. He did not immediately collapse into forgiveness, but the chains loosened. What followed felt like the hard labor of a life rebuilt. They patched the porch, replanted a garden, put lids on pots that hadn't been simmered in years. People watched and snipped and muttered. Silas came back once with papers and threats, thinking the memory of a widow and a lonely man would be leverage. He found Miriam hanging laundry and Jonah fixing a step. They did not seem like the dangerous sinners he'd hoped to shame. Jonah laughed, the sound a little rough, a little rusty, and told Silas to take his papers and go. He refused to be cajoled by reputation. That winter the terrible noises stopped, then dwindled like a tide. Jonah still carried the weight of memory. Some nights he would sit on the porch and speak her name, Lydia, like a benediction instead of a condemnation. He still missed Evie in a way that made his chest hollow, but the throat grip that had almost claimed him loosened. Guilt lost its deadly edge when shared over coffee and shared nights. Miriam and Jonah did not rush into romance. Theirs was a slow-growing thing, like the apple tree Miriam remembered from her childhood back in Ohio. It began with the simple acts of two adults who decided to repair more than a house. They repaired the space between themselves and the rest of the world. They learned to talk about money as a joint problem. They made plans for the herd and for the garden. They spoke about the future not as a fragile possibility, but as a plan. They also fought. The gentle, real arguments of two people who are not perfect, but refuse to desert what is fair and true. When Jonah admitted he sometimes still feared the pull of the unknown, Miriam would take his hands and tell him to tell her everything. When Miriam fretted about the town's gossip, Jonah would say, "Let them talk. We know the truth. That's what matters." The house filled up with sound again. The slap of the mail on the porch, the clang of the skillet, the thump of a child's ball one afternoon when a niece from the next town came to visit. Laughter arrived like a new tenant with a key. The valley seemed kinder for it. On a spring day when the apple tree in the yard was thick with green buds, Jonah watched Miriam working the soil and felt a gratitude that had the quality of prayer. He spoke the thing he'd never quite said since Lydia and Evie left his life. "You saved me." Miriam wiped the dirt from her hands with the hem of her skirt and looked up. "We saved each other," she said, which was truer. They hugged then, not in a way meant to astonish the sky, but in the way two people who have chosen to stay for the hard work of living hold each other. A steady, deliberate clasp. Sage Hollow kept its gossip for a while. Silas's threats turned into sour mutters. People adjusted. Some came to borrow sugar. Some came to invite Jonah to the harvest dance. Folks looked at him like a man who had learned to live with his past rather than be buried by it. When the harvest came, and the barn held more hay than it had in a long while, Miriam cooked a big meal, and Jonah sat with his hands dangling over his knees and smiled the kind of smile that knew its own depth. He never said again, in the blunt way he had at the beginning, that feeding him had made him yearn for something else. He didn't need to. Every biscuit, every stew, every cup of coffee poured with warmth carried the sentiment that had once been awkwardly voiced and was now a quiet, steady truth. You can feed someone's body, and it will keep going. You can feed someone's heart, and it will learn to beat in rhythm with another. Miriam and Jonah found, in the slow, generous work of keeping house and land, that the hands that cook can also cradle, and the hands that mend fences can also stitch up the frayed edges of a life. If this story moved you, leave a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what you'd like to see more of. Want darker, spookier twists? More slow-burn romance? Shorter serial installments? Say the word. If you enjoyed this, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps more than you know. If you prefer, share your own small-town story, or a time when someone's simple kindness pulled you back from the edge. Your voice changes the next story I tell. Miriam and Jonah did not live a perfect life. They had bills and worries and nights when the wind sounded like an accusation. But they learned that the truest antidote to shame and loneliness is not secrecy or running away. It is the brave, ordinary choice to stay and to feed one another with patience, work, and truth.